and welcome to the Movie Fanatics. My name is Brannick. The art of film can give life to terrifying, beautiful, and wondrous pictures that can impact a person. No other film in recent memory has done that for me more so than Stanley Kubrick's 1980 masterpiece, The Shining. I was taken aback by the amount of hard work and care that went into the making of every aspect of the picture, and have since rewatched it multiple times. I saw this film for the very first time earlier this year and have since fallen in love with it. I've hinted at my enjoyment of The Shining a couple times on the channel, and first referred to it as my favorite horror film and one of my favorite films ever in my review of Dr. Sleep, its sequel. The film was first mentioned on our channel in one of our earlier videos, which is still our most popular video as of recording this. The video in question is my video about the Dies Irae, which only mentioned The Shining because the piece in the beginning of the movie references the Dies Irae. At the time of making that video, I had not seen the film and had no desire to. That all changed earlier this year when I was first introduced to Stanley Kubrick by watching 2001: A Space Odyssey. I was aware that Kubrick was regarded as being one of, if not the greatest filmmakers of all time. I just never got around to watching any of his movies. But after watching 2001, it became very clear why Kubrick had such profound recognition. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a masterclass in filmmaking and a work of art. A very boring work of art, but I have so much respect for it. So much respect for the way it changed the scope of filmmaking since its release. After seeing 2001, I of course wanted to see more of Kubrick, but it took a while for that to actually happen. However, over the summer, I got really into horror films, and with that, The Shining looked more appealing to watch than ever. Eventually, I sat down, turned off all the lights in my basement to set the mood, and hit play. What followed next was a thrilling adventure and an expertly crafted film that I obviously hold in very high regard. One last thing before we get started. If you have not seen the movie, please do not watch this video. I will be bringing up a lot of details from it. I'll be talking about the ending and just spoiling it in general. If you think you won't plan on watching this movie and just want to watch this video just for kicks, you're making a mistake. I implore you to watch this movie. If you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of Kubrick, if you're a fan of movies in general, or even if you're not, I think this movie should be viewed by all. My friends have grown tired of me constantly bringing up this movie in casual conversation, so now I will bore all you dear viewers with a video that is far too long for its own good. This is The Shining.
Here's Johnny!
Stanley Kubrick is, of course, the director of many incredible films, and his vision for this one is on full display here. The man was an incredible filmmaker. The way shots are executed and framed is really good here. There are a lot of these shots where the camera goes through the wall as the characters are going through a doorway, and the way the characters are framed in the Overlook's massive rooms make it seem like it's devouring them. There are so many incredible shots in this movie, such as the shot of Jack in the pantry that's shot from below. It's funny how nonchalantly Kubrick comes up with such an iconic shot.
Can you do with your head down? Yeah. Well, that's not bad. Do that. Try that, Jack.
Wendy, listen to me.
But not only was Kubrick director of the film, he was also its co-writer along with Diane Johnson. Stephen King is probably the most famous and widely loved horror author of all time. He's written a lot of popular books. I had never read one of his books prior to reading The Shining, and even when I finished the movie, I didn't plan on reading the book. But I did, and I'm happy I did, because The Shining is an excellent novel. And I now plan on reading more of King in the future, because it's very clear he's a very talented author. The Shining is engaging from beginning to end. Which is pretty impressive, because I like reading, I just never do it that often. The version of the book I had was about 450 pages long, and if a book of that length could keep me engaged for its entirety, that's pretty great. But King's novel The Shining and Kubrick's movie The Shining are two very different entities. A lot of changes were made to the book's story when adapting it to the screen. If you haven't read the book, I would skip this segment. I'm going to be talking about The Shining as an adaptation for a little while, and I will also be spoiling the book. There are some pretty noticeable differences between the two stories. In terms of things in the book that I now wish were in the movie, I really like the parts of the book with the wasp nest. I had had this pointed out to me, but the wasps that come back to life after the bug bomb kills them are a metaphor for alcoholism. That's pretty neat. As good as the edge animals were, I think the maze is just a bit cooler, so that can stick around if you ask me. A lot of Jack's backstory that made him such a compelling character in the novel is sadly cut from the movie, but I understand why. Most of those sections are in the form of memories or dream sequences, which wouldn't really fit the film. While an axe is a much more threatening weapon than a roque melon, I think the recurrence of the take your medicine line would have been cool in the movie, and I'm glad it's included in some form in Dr. Sleep. The masquerade ball is kind of in the movie, but I like the unmask line symbolizing the hotel taking off its mask and becoming truly alive in the book. However, there are some things in the book that I think were right to omit from the movie. First of all, Roger in the book is kind of weird, and I think the new scene with him in the movie is a lot better. It's way more quick and mysterious, and it's super effective. The inclusion of the Grady sisters in the movie is really cool, and I was a little disappointed that they weren't featured at all in the book. But the most notable difference between the two versions is the ending. At the end of the book, Jack traps Danny in a hallway, but he's able to fight off the hotel's possession just long enough for Danny to get away. He tells Danny he loves him, and Wendy, Danny, and Halloran all leave the hotel. Jack hadn't been maintaining the boiler, so the hotel explodes and burns down. In the epilogue, Halloran, Wendy, and Danny enjoy some fishing on a summer day. The movie is quite different. First of all, the hotel does not explode, and Halloran died. That right there is really different, but Jack doesn't die after letting Danny escape and then blowing up in the hotel. He freezes to death in the maze, and Danny and Wendy escape by themselves. And the last shot just reinforces the idea that the hotel is still very much alive. But the biggest change tonally is that the book ends optimistically, and the movie does not. The book sees Jack telling Danny he loves him one last time before dying, allowing the family a chance for survival. And in the epilogue, the 3 survivors of the Overlook enjoy a warm day of summer fishing. Sure, in the movie, basically the same thing happens if you strip everything away. Jack dies and Wendy and Danny escape, but it's presented very differently in the film. Jack doesn't get a redeeming ending in the film. He mercilessly murders Halloran and then tries to kill his 5-year-old son. And Danny doesn't escape after being given a chance for survival. He just outsmarts his dad in the maze. Nothing about this ending feels happy. I think the ending is a major part of the argument presented by King fans that the movie removed all the heart from the novel. But perhaps the movie's biggest critic and loudest detractor was Stephen King himself, who despised the film, saying that Kubrick set out to make a movie that hurts people. And he was right. The Shining is not easy to watch, and it was not designed to end in an optimistic manner. But because of all the differences, a 1997, more accurate to the book miniseries was released. Now, I haven't seen Stephen King's The Shining, but from what I've heard, it's not very good. That's the opinions of others, not the opinion of me, because I haven't seen it. The debate between good movie or good movie adaptation persists with The Shining, and yeah, if you define a good adaptation as being incredibly accurate to the source material, then Kubrick's movie is a terrible adaptation. But I think an adaptation can make changes. I think the filmmaker can change the story to make it better if they see fit. Obviously, I prefer the film, but I really love the novel. And I think I can end this by saying that this is a fantastic horror movie, and this is a fantastic piece of horror writing. They're different stories. They're separate stories in my mind. But what matters at the end of the day is that they're both good stories. The story of The Shining is quite simple when you look at it from the surface level. The film opens with Jack Torrance driving to the Overlook Hotel for a job interview as winter caretaker. His 5-year-old son Danny has a vision using the titular Shining ability about the sinister consequences that staying at the hotel would bring about. He's seen by a doctor who says there's nothing wrong with Danny, as Wendy very casually explains the time that Jack in a drunken rage dislocated Danny's shoulder. They go to the Overlook and Danny's visions only increase, and we notice changes in Jack. Jack eventually tries to murder his wife and child, although unsuccessfully as they escape at the end of the movie, while Jack freezes to death in the hedge maze. When you put it on paper, the story sounds as simple can be. However, watching the movie is a completely different experience, and the story is presented in a completely different way in the film. The synopsis I just gave is the story at its core, but it's surrounded by all these branching paths that make The Shining such an interesting movie to view. There's a lot going on under the surface. A lot of different, sometimes contradictory things are implied. This should lead to a frustrating movie to watch where the viewer never really knows what's going on and thus doesn't get invested. But the opposite is true. Watching the film for the first time, I found all the little clues and hints incredibly intriguing to a point where I didn't even get up to go to the bathroom while watching. That confusion is the heart of the viewing experience. It's up to the viewer to put all the puzzle pieces together and see the bigger picture. Of course, one of those pictures is just how it is presented on the back of the box. A writer goes insane in a hotel and tries to kill his family. Of course, that's a perfectly fine way to watch the movie. Sometimes, most of the time, that's how I like to interpret it. But there's so much more in the realm of theories and possible explanations. That factor is what gives The Shining its rewatchability. Every time the viewer sits down to watch the movie, they have the potential to see something completely different or see something completely new than they did last time. When Jack wanders aimlessly through the hedge maze screaming incoherent babble, and then freezes to death, the viewer may assume, as I did, that this is the end of the film. The final shot would be a perfectly passable ending. However, instead we get this slow crawl through the hotel lobby to the hallway which leads to the gold room. We see furniture covered in tarps. We don't know where in time we are. The camera steadily glides forward as we hear the song Midnight, the Stars and You echoing through the corridors, implying that the party in the gold room is in full swing again. Eventually the shot has reached its destination, a collection of black and white photographs, just as unnoticeable as any other similar collages throughout the hotel. Except the camera zooms in on the one dead center, and we see Jack Torrance, a smile on his face, staring back at us. The photo is captioned, "The Overlook Hotel, July 4th Ball of 1921. It has been there the whole time, merely overlooked." This is one of my favorite movie endings of all time. It's an ending that ties up some loose ends, but then opens up so many others. I feel like it's this ending that started fans' obsession with hyperanalyzing this movie to death. Because if there was a detail that was so small and unnoticeable but turned out to be central to the story, then that means everything in the background is central to the story in some way. Again, Kubrick really stripped down the story of the novel and changed a lot overall. But this allows for a more ambiguous, interesting, and rewatchable story that has kept fans hooked for decades. I'll talk about fan interpretations and popular theories about what it all means later down the line. But for now, just know that I love the story for this movie, and a lot of times I do like to interpret it as just what it is on the surface. Sometimes I just like to interpret it as a simple story of a man losing his mind in a hotel with some terrifying elements. But again, more on interpretation later. Score is one of my favorite parts of any movie. However, the art form is not nearly as appreciated as any other aspect of filmmaking. How many movies have you seen and loved but can't hum a single piece of music from it?
Are there any movies you despise but still don't at least appreciate the music?
I know I've done both of these in the past. I really don't like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but going back to listen to the soundtrack, it ain't that bad. And I enjoyed the Fear Street trilogy, but I can't tell you how any of the original score went. But there are also instances where the score is incredibly memorable. I will never forget the main theme from Up, and it will never fail to make me just a little sad. Pixar music always hits home. Star Wars has some incredible music. I don't think that's that much of a hot take. John Williams really is a master of his craft, and I think Revenge of the Sith might just be my favorite movie OST of all time. The theme of Jaws perfectly represents the shark in musical form. The Harry Potter movies soundtracks, even the ones not done by Williams, are really good. There are some differences in musical ideas and motifs between films because the composers change so many times. But the reason I bring all this up is because music in film is supposed to be the audio representation of the atmosphere of the scene. If there's an intense action scene, we're gonna get some fast-paced, adrenaline-pumping music. If there's a sad scene, soft piano and strings are on the menu. Film scores seek to enhance the feel, atmosphere, tone, and themes of a scene. And a film that does this better than most is The Shining. Oh yeah, that's what the video is about. Now, The Shining is unique because you can't really listen to its music outside of the context of the film. I mean, you can, nothing's stopping you except your conscience, but the music in The Shining really isn't music at all. Well, I guess it still is music technically, but if you're snapping along to Polymorphia, I'm concerned for you. I divide the music from The Shining into two main categories: the score that plays in the background during scenes, and the music chosen for the background of the ballroom scenes. And then the main theme is just floating off there somewhere. My reason for this divide is that, for the most part, there is a lack of a coherent melody throughout most of the pieces in this movie, so we're starting there. The score is basically just sounds playing at offbeat random times that gets incredibly unnerving after a while. We're watching Jack descend into madness and become ever more hostile, all backed by these unsettling pieces. It's like we're traveling into his broken psyche. My favorite of these is the aforementioned Polymorphia, which at my favorite point in the song, about halfway through, begins to get quicker and quicker, stabbing at you with the string section. Basically, the whole score is like this, unnerving sounds that really seep into your mind. Another one of my favorites is the moment where Wendy realizes what red rum means. And after Jack murders Halloran, we get these demonic chants that make it seem like the hotel is now fully alive. All in all, the score really is amazing, but we're not done yet because the main theme does have a melody. And it's an old one. Yes, the opening theme uses the Dies Irae, the ancient Gregorian chant that was used during medieval funeral masses. This theme has been used to symbolize death in music for centuries, and we get one of my favorite renditions of it here in the opening. Dies Irae, Dies Irae. We get another piece using the same synthesizer later in the movie when the Torrances are driving to the hotel. This one isn't as good as the opening in my opinion, but it's still very off-putting. The last of the soundtrack is, of course, the ballroom tracks. There aren't very many of them, but they're all really good. The two I want to discuss are probably the most famous, but one definitely gets more attention than the other. We'll talk about the less revered one first. It's All Forgotten Now is a really chill, almost lullaby-like song that plays when Grady and Jack are conversing in the bathroom. It echoing in the background of the scene, still playing in the ballroom, is really eerie. I like it a lot. It being in the background of the scene is probably the reason that it's not as well known as its big brother, the one that everyone loves, Midnight, the Stars, and You. I can't really complain about this one being more famous than the other song, because this is my favorite track from the movie. This song is definitely in the spotlight more. It plays when Jack is at the party, and of course it plays over the film's ending. That makes sense why it's more popular. It's the last thing that you hear before the movie ends. I mentioned earlier that the song echoing through the halls in the background implies that the party in the Gold Room is going on again, and that's supported even further by the credits. The song plays for most of the credits, but after it ends, we get applause and then a crowd of people chatting. When I stayed around after the credits and discovered that, I was very happy. I love this song to death, and I listen to it a lot. And even though it was featured in a horror film, whenever I listen to it on my own, it just gives me a little tinge of sadness. I implied that the music of this movie was responsible for its atmosphere, but that's only half true, because another major contributor to the atmosphere is the setting. A major part of the appeal, legacy, and horror of The Shining is its setting, the large, isolated, possibly supernatural, Overlook Hotel. It's such a creative and unsettling place, and it gives the movie a really unique feel. While other horror movies showcase a variety of settings, The Shining takes place almost entirely within the Overlook. I'm not saying that other horror flicks don't have just one location, plenty do, but The Shining presents it differently, really hammering home the idea that the Torrances are isolated here and trapped in this setting. For example, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre takes place almost entirely within this one spot, the property and the area surrounding the property of the cannibalistic family. But we go throughout different parts of the area in the film. There's the abandoned home in the beginning, the family's home, and just the plain old woods. The point is, while this is all one place, it feels like different, interconnected settings that we build a sense of familiarity with, especially when Leatherface chases Sally around the grounds. The Shining does not offer that same sense of familiarity. First of all, the Overlook's different rooms feel connectedly disconnected, leading to a setting that has a captivatingly cryptic layout. Also in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we know where Leatherface is. He's in the house. That leads to a lot of suspense when the characters are near and in the house, but when they're not, tension is kind of lost. In The Shining, we know exactly where the apparitions are. They're in the hotel with Wendy and Danny. And so is Jack. We watch Jack lose his sanity slowly while being snowbound with the people he plans to harm. This leads to a great deal of suspense. So the threat is localized, but the hotel doesn't actually have a cohesive layout. This is one of the most famous aspects of the Overlook. The layout of the building does not make any sense. This leads to the viewer feeling lost in this place. And with vague time cards saying things like Tuesday, we also feel lost in time. We build familiarity with areas of the hotel, like the Torrance's bedroom, for instance, but it's hard to visualize where the bedroom is in relation to the Colorado Lounge or the Gold Room. Wendy is seen in the boiler room, but we never go back. Similarly, Wendy finds the elevator of blood in the dark red hallway that isn't seen before or after. This building is a confusing maze, and we rarely get scenes that connect it together. We know that the Gold Room connects to the lobby, which connects to Ullman's office, but we don't know how the boiler room connects to the Colorado Lounge. The closest we get to discovering more about the layout is through Danny's trike rides, but even these have some confusing gaps in them, particularly with this cut. We start in this large green corridor. Danny rounds a corner, and then we're very clearly in a different part of the hotel. Obviously, during the cut, we're jumping in time either to later on the trike ride or a different ride entirely, but it makes the scene feel intentionally confusing. The hotel's confusing layout adds to the feeling of suspense, because
because we now know that the characters are trapped in this confusing maze. And the design of the hotel itself is uncanny. The hotel features these rooms that almost look cozy, but there's just something off about them. For example, the carpet in the hallways is iconic and instantly recognizable. It features bold, angular lines and colors that just don't really seem to fit together, giving the hallways a hypnotic quality. Room 237 features a carpet with a pattern resembling arrows, all pointing in one direction, towards the bathroom, along with greens and purples that also give off an uncanny feel. The colors really give the rooms an uncanny feel. The use of solid, bold colors really struck a chord with me the first time I watched this movie. The Gold Room's bathroom is bright red and appears to be much larger than the small part we see of it. Room 237's bathroom employs a similar concept, but with a sickly green that matches the carpet of the room. The aforementioned red hallway is just that, blood red. The hallway that leads to the Gold Room and the Gold Room itself almost feel like they belong in a completely different building. The gargantuan Colorado lounge symbolizes the hotel's size beautifully. In some shots, it feels like the hotel has swallowed Jack whole. The hotel was allegedly built on a Native American burial ground and has a lot of native designs and artwork in it. This has led to a popular fan theory, which I will touch upon later. I mentioned that the hotel's layout makes it feel like a maze, but the hotel happens to have an actual maze. The hedge maze is one of my favorite parts of this movie. This is where Jack chases Danny and eventually meets his demise. The maze really symbolizes the hotel's cryptic design, and also the fact that Jack has truly become lost. And the Torrance's experience with the maze reflects the experience they've had with the hotel as well. In the beginning, Wendy and Danny jovially walk through the maze together, much how like in the beginning the family's excited to stay in the beautiful hotel. But by the end, they're trying to escape both the hotel and the maze and to get away from Jack. In the end of the novel, the hotel explodes, but at the end of the movie, the hotel is shown to be very much alive, with Jack's picture on the wall and a lively party being heard from the Gold Room. And I say the word alive very loosely, because in the movie it's left ambiguous as to whether or not the hotel is truly like a living thing, or if the family are just going insane together. In the sequel, Dr. Sleep, the hotel is basically just said to be alive, but I kinda liked it when it's kept vague. And that ambiguity is important because despite being isolated, the Torrances do not appear to be alone. The apparitions seen by the Torrances in the movie are some of the most memorable parts from the film, and it's not exactly hard to see why. It's left unclear if these things are real or not. What if Danny is just shining? What if Jack is just losing his mind? What if Wendy is just hallucinating because of the stress of the whole situation? I'll go into greater detail about all that later in this already too long video, but for now, let's start with the most iconic ghosts, hands down. The Grady twins are easily the most famous. They've been referenced so many times.
Come drink new Mountain Dew Zero Sugar with us.
Too many times. Yes, Ullman says that the girls were 8 and 10, but he also says that Grady's first name was Charles when later it's said to be Delbert. And besides, they're clearly shown to be twins. But they're neat and super effective. It's weird how iconic they are because they're basically only in 2 scenes, not counting the moments where they randomly flash on the screen for a second. The Shining does this with all of its ghosts. They show up for 1 or 2 scenes and then are never seen again. I think what really sells the twins is Danny's reaction when he sees them. In the first scene with them in the games room, we focus on Danny's reaction after he's seen them before we, the audience, see them. And Danny doesn't even seem that scared, more so confused, but why should he be scared? There are people all over the Overlook at this point. But the strange behavior of the twins combined with the droning soundtrack leads to a really eerie scene. Their next, far more famous scene is of course the scene in the hallway. This time, Danny has a face of startled surprise. They're supposed to be alone in the Overlook. However, once Danny gets the vision of the sisters' mangled bodies, he shakes in terror and covers his eyes.
Remember what Mr. Halloran said. It's just like pictures in a book, Danny. It isn't real.
Although this is off-screen, Danny is also shown to have met Mrs. Massey, the woman in the bathtub in room 237. Though the bruises on his neck were also implied to have been caused by Jack, who also has an encounter with Mrs. Massey. Jack slowly walks towards the bathroom of room 237, where he enters and finds a nude woman in the tub, who walks over and they kiss. It continues until Jack looks in the mirror and sees that the woman he was kissing is now old and decaying. He clumsily stumbles out of the bathroom as Mrs. Massey lumbers towards him, cackling madly. We also see shots of an old woman in the tub, and people have debated whether or not this is Mrs. Massey or some other woman, because they look slightly different. I don't know, but Jack leaves 237 and we still hear Mrs. Massey cackling through the closed door. The other 2 apparitions that Jack sees are my absolute favorites from the film, Lloyd and Delbert Grady. Starting with Lloyd, the bar scenes are some of my favorites, if not my favorites from the whole movie. The first one begins with Jack walking up to the bar and saying this.
for a drink. In my goddamn soul. Just a glass of beer.
And then Lloyd and a fully stocked bar appear.
Hi, Lloyd. A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Mr. Torrance.
Lloyd is played by Joe Turkel, who I think was chosen for the role because of his appearance and his voice. Lloyd's face is gaunt, with deep, dark eyes and a slight half-smile. He speaks in a deep, hollow-sounding voice.
No, sir. Not busy at all.
Lloyd juxtaposes Jack really nicely here. Jack spasms wildly in between shots, but Lloyd remains still as a statue, the slight smile still on his face. Honestly, the conversation with Lloyd feels like Jack is talking to himself. The camera rarely shows Lloyd, only when he's talking, which is uncommon. Lloyd stands still, and when he speaks, it's sharp and quick, his face staying as stoic as it was before. Also, Lloyd never blinks. Lloyd stands there and listens to Jack saying these horrible, horrible things about his wife and son, all with that benign little smile on his face. He silently tells Jack that he's in the right, even though he's not. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, Lloyd is gone as Wendy bursts into the room to tell Jack about Mrs. Massey. In the next scene, in the ballroom, a party is raging as Jack walks up to the bar again. This scene is much shorter than the first one, and it really just serves to show that Jack doesn't have to pay for his drink. He's already paid with something other than currency. As Jack dances to the absolute banger that is Midnight, the Stars and You, my other favorite, Ghost, literally stumbles into the movie, spilling his tray onto Jack. The butler offers to clean Jack's jacket up, and they go to the red bathroom. The butler is clumsy, nervous-sounding, and ever hospitable to Jack when Jack asks for his name.
What do they call you around here, Jeezy?
Grady, sir. Delbert Grady.
Delbert Grady. Ullman spoke of a Charles Grady who murdered his family in the beginning of the film, but here we have Delbert Grady, and past this point, the illusion of friendliness the mask Grady was wearing is now gone. Grady now speaks very directly and intentionally, and Philip Stone plays this role expertly. Similarly with Lloyd, Jack's face constantly changes, but Grady's face remains the same, and Grady is now obviously in control of the conversation, asking Jack the questions, and his use of a racial slur, referring to Halloran, makes the situation even more uncomfortable, and makes Grady even more detestable. Still, you can't take your eyes off him. Stone speaks every word with surprising clarity, and I really like the way he rolls his R when he says the word bring.
Did you know, Mr. Torrance, that your son is attempting to bring an outside party into this situation?
Grady also enforces Jack's desire to harm his family, painting the action as honorable, gloating about how he corrected his wife and daughters. And much like Lloyd, Grady never blinks. Also, during the whole interaction, Jack is looking into the mirror. He's also looking into a mirror during the Mrs. Massey scene and the scene with Lloyd. Keep that in mind for later. Grady appears one more time in the film, appearing as a disembodied voice before unlocking the pantry, giving Jack one last chance to murder Wendy and Danny. Grady and Lloyd are easily my two favorite ghosts from the Overlook. There's others too, pretty much just one-offs like all the people in the Gold Room. Then there's Horace Derwent, who we know from the book was one of the hotel's previous owners, but in the movie he just goes, "Great party, isn't it?" and then that's it. There's the exceptionally strange scene with the man in the animal costume, and the scene where Wendy finds all the skeletons in the lobby. I guess the blood elevator kind of counts for this section of the video, so I'll just say that it's a very neat shot, and the part where Wendy sees it is just awesome. It perfectly symbolizes the hotel when Danny has a vision of it. It's iconic for a reason, just like the Grady twins. Supernatural or not, the visions that the Torrances have at the Overlook are some of the most memorable parts of the movie. However, the apparitions were never the most interesting part of the movie. The real driving force behind The Shining is the characters, so let's discuss them next. When it comes to discussions about The Shining, the conversations really tend to focus on Danny, Jack, the Overlook, The Shining itself, ghosts, or just iconic moments in general. And when it comes to discussions of characters, Wendy is very, very rarely brought up, which is why, in my opinion, she is the most underappreciated character in the whole movie. With every part of this video talking about a certain character, we will first discuss the actor portraying them. In this case, Wendy Torrance is portrayed by Shelley Duvall. Shelley Duvall was nominated for a Golden Razzie for her performance in this movie, which in my opinion is the most unwarranted Razzie nomination of all time. Duvall gives one of the most heartbreakingly realistic portrayals of fear and emotional distress ever put to screen. Just look at the iconic scene where Jack axes the door.
I've heard people say that Duvall is overacting here and throughout the whole movie, but I completely disagree. This scene is the portrayal that Wendy is horrified. Duvall rapidly switches between covering her face and looking at the axe, making slow progress at breaking through the door. She is shaking uncontrollably, screaming the entire time. This is what any of us would do in this situation. Don't lie. Her disturbingly realistic portrayal of mental turmoil and true horror is what left such a lasting impression on me. It's crazy how every single role in this movie is perfectly cast, and Shelley Duvall is no exception. And I guess we can't proceed without acknowledging a part of why Duvall delivers such an incredible performance. This isn't a big secret, but it's worth discussing anyway. Duvall's experience shooting The Shining was incredibly emotionally draining. Kubrick was constantly rude to her and asked the crew to do the same. He did this in order to get the best performance possible out of her, and it worked, but the lasting emotional damage it caused for Duvall just isn't fair, despite her saying that she came to respect Kubrick once she saw the movie. In short, she was nominated for a Razzie, but she deserved an Oscar. Anyway, let's talk about Wendy now. As stated earlier, Wendy is often overshadowed by her husband and son, but she is equally as important to the story. Wendy doesn't really have a character arc in this movie. She remains mostly static, appearing as a kind woman, but with a layer of emotional damage. And as the film progresses, that layer of Wendy's character is put in the spotlight as she is overwhelmed with the stress and emotional trauma of what's happening to her and her family. It's obvious that she cares tremendously for both her husband and her son, but you can tell that her concern lies more with Danny. Her biggest worries with Danny's well-being, especially after Jack injures his arm. She immediately blames Jack for the bruises on Danny's neck, despite there being an infinite amount of ways for a child to hurt himself in a giant hotel. But she is justified in her assumption based on Jack's actions before and during the film. That growing stress of watching her husband become more abusive and unhinged is obviously very deeply disturbing for Wendy, just as it is for the audience. And Wendy spends the finale of the film a couple steps back behind the other two main characters and the audience. After Danny escapes through the window and then re-enters and Jack kills Halloran, Wendy exits the bathroom. As Jack chases Danny outside, Wendy is frantically running throughout the endless hallways of the Overlook, knife still in hand, trying to get to Danny before Jack does, not knowing that they're both in the hedge maze. She finds Halloran's body, and then either the Overlook decides to finally unmask itself to her, or she begins to hallucinate because of the extreme stress of the situation. But either way, Wendy begins to see apparitions. She eventually does go outside, finding Danny and driving away with him. Wendy in the movie is much more timid and less strong-willed than her book counterpart, which I attribute to her relationship with Jack being much healthier in the book. In the movie, their relationship is much more strained and abusive, and it's obvious that Jack doesn't even like her. Even as they arrive, Jack acts rude to Wendy, which he didn't do to Ullman or any other people. Wendy is mainly verbally abused by Jack, but that then turns to violence later in the movie. I'll go into more detail about the abusive undertones of this movie later, because Jack is definitely abusive towards Wendy and Danny. I wish I had more to say about Wendy since she's such a sympathetic character, one we feel for, but I think I've said about all I can. She adds to the tense tone of the movie because there's such a brokenness to her, and Shelley Duvall portrays her wonderfully. We now continue our discussion of the Torrances. The next one in line is the one that Wendy feels the most compassion for, the one that she loves more than anything else in the whole world, her son. In my review of Dr. Sleep, I stated that Danny was one of the most interesting characters in The Shining, second only to his father. And while a lot of my opinions about The Shining, and especially Dr. Sleep, have since changed, I stand by that one. Child actors are always hit or miss. Most often miss, let's be honest. Whether or not that hits too close to home remains to be seen. But anyway, Danny Torrance is played by Danny Lloyd. Also, quick side note because I think it's cool. Danny Lloyd makes a cameo appearance in Dr. Sleep as this guy at the baseball game. And I know I sound like I'm repeating myself, but Danny Lloyd gives one of the best child performances of all time, in my opinion. First of all, he's adorable.
All I thought about is what
What? What do you think about?
all I thought about is what my mom and my dad was gonna buy me.
Gonna buy you? For what?
With all that money.
Uh-huh. And do you know how much you were going to be earning per week?
No, really, I didn't know.
Did they tell you?
I didn't know really how much I was gonna. I didn't know really I was gonna earn any money.
No.
No, I just thought I would just get $2 or so.
Yeah?
So,
A bit of pocket money, huh?
yeah.
Yeah, right.
And so now I know I probably have $500 or $600.
And he's really good in the role, especially with his line delivery, which is normally the bad thing about child actors. There is one line where it sounds a little weird, but it's fine.
You mean they ate each other up?
But all in all, Danny Lloyd is great. Now I'm going to bring up the book again because Danny is pretty similar to his book counterpart, especially compared to Jack and Wendy. But one noticeable difference you might have noticed if you've experienced both forms of the story is that Danny in the movie is really quiet. Danny is 5 years old, but in the book he talked in these long, complete, basically adult sentences. I guess that can be explained by him being able to read adults' thoughts, but he doesn't understand a lot of what he takes in by Shining. For example, he knows his parents are thinking about divorce, and he understands that divorce is bad, but he doesn't really know what divorce is. His vocabulary wasn't a big problem, but it was just a little distracting in the book. Point is that in the movie, Danny acts like a 5-year-old kid, which is what he is. If you haven't read the book, or even if you have, that might seem pretty nitpicky, but my point is that in the film, I like Danny's dialogue way better. But he is very quiet, and he always tries to shift the conversation away from The Shining and Tony. The fact that he's a kid and doesn't really understand what's going on around him is an important part of his characterization. Danny knows that the hotel is bad and that they shouldn't go there, and the unbelievable trauma that he experiences there is only amplified by the fact that he's a child. Danny is horrified of the concept of red rum, but he can't do anything about it. I really think the turning point for Danny's character is when he gets the bruises on his neck. I like that the source of the bruises is left ambiguous. Like, there's basically two explanations. Mrs. Massey did it to him, or Jack did it to him during this scene. We don't really know because it's implied that it could be either. We see Danny enter 237, but we never see him in there interacting with Mrs. Massey. But we also don't see the end of the scene with Jack. But whatever the cause may be, Tony becomes more prominent after this. And that, of course, begins with this scene.
Danny's not here, Mrs. Torrance.
And after this point, Danny only uses Tony voice until Jack begins his axe rampage. During this, Tony's consistent scowl melts away as Danny's face of terror comes back, and he uses his normal voice again after escaping the maze. However, when Danny uses the Tony voice, it's left very vague. Is he just using the Tony voice, or has he begun to lose his sanity? Is Tony a real entity, or is it just The Shining and he doesn't know how to explain it? Whatever the truth is, isn't said, but the film ends with Danny being chased through the labyrinth by his father. This last scene is absolutely thrilling, and when Danny tricks his father by hiding his footprints and then escaping, it's just great. For once, a horror movie character outsmarts their opponent. All in all, Danny's one of my favorite characters in the movie. His damage is not as visible as Wendy, but he still makes an incredible journey. And all of this is really propelled by the trait that makes him so unique, his psychic ability.
My grandmother and I could hold conversations entirely without ever opening our mouths. She called it shining.
I will be honest, watching The Shining, I didn't go in completely raw. I knew about the intro, I knew about the end where Jack freezes to death, I knew about the Grady sisters, and I also knew about the guy in the animal costume for some reason. And I knew that they go to a hotel and the dad goes crazy with an axe. But those are all thankfully pretty small or pretty vague things. I didn't know any key specific plot elements. But I also knew the film's title. Most people do, but something I never even thought to question was why the movie was called The Shining. I was legitimately confused when Halloran knew what Danny's nickname was. And when he offered Danny ice cream, I was super confused. But then came the scene where Halloran elaborates on both of those things. And when he name-dropped the ability, I questioned why I never wondered where the movie's title came from. And it's strange, because the reason for a movie's title is always, at least in the back of my mind, when I see a new movie. I just always kind of knew that the movie was called The Shining, and I never questioned why. It's weird that the movie is titled that way, because it really isn't focused that heavily on The Shining at all. And that goes for the book too. I know it's more prevalent there because we get to read Danny's thoughts. I don't know, it's still a little weird. But our link to The Shining is, of course, Dick Halloran. Halloran is a cook who works in the Overlook's kitchen. He and his grandmother both shared the trade, and Grandma Halloran named the trade. Halloran is extremely important to the story, despite being absent for it for the majority of its runtime. After all, it's indirectly because of him that Danny and Wendy are able to escape the Overlook and Jack. People say that Halloran got wasted in this movie because he came to the Overlook and then immediately died. And yeah, he did, but he didn't die in vain because Wendy and Danny were able to escape because of him. Halloran first shines in the movie when he calls Danny Doc, but we really first see him shine when he offers Danny ice cream. But after that, we get this massive exposition dump where he explains why he and Danny are different from other people. He also implies that the Overlook itself shines. And Halloran suspects that a lot of people have the Shining and they just don't know it. If the Shining is passed down genetically, like from Halloran's grandma to Halloran, then maybe Jack and Wendy also shine.
And perhaps the hotel's own malevolent shine brings out Wendy and Danny's shine, explaining the visions that they see. But Halloran and Danny are the only characters confirmed to shine, and Danny's shine is a key reason that he is such an interesting character to watch. And again, his young age makes his realization of the power and the curse it is much more intriguing to watch. As said, in the book, the shining is much more prevalent because we get to read Danny's thoughts, and he thinks about Tony and the shining a lot. I think the uniqueness of the shining and its relevance to the plot is what makes it so interesting. I love the way the shining is handled in this movie. It's used very strategically here, and it's still a driving force of the story. It's all like a domino effect. If Danny hadn't shined to Halloran, then they all would have died. And with Dr. Sleep explaining all the different ways the shining can be used and the different forms it takes, I don't know, I kind of liked how it was before. But it's a really cool plot point, a really cool ability, and I'm super glad that it's included in this story. Jack Torrance is a huge reason why this movie is so remembered and revered today. And a lot of that comes from Jack Nicholson's legendary performance in this film. If you held a gun to my head and asked me what my favorite performance of all time was, I'd first ask you what your motives were, and then I would respond with Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance. And a lot of the memorability from Nicholson's performance comes from his physicality. This is on full display just by looking at the man's facial expressions. Nicholson has an insane amount of control over his facial muscles. He appears to be making a completely different face in every shot. He contorts his body and his face wildly, and this only increases as he becomes more and more insane.
I did hurt him once, okay? It was an accident. Completely unintentional. Could have happened to anybody.
And there is a reason for this uncanny, insane performance. Kubrick infamously did take after take after take for The Shining, sometimes going well over 100, and he did this for almost each individual shot. And the editors for The Shining noticed that around the 40th or 50th take, the actors began to behave noticeably differently. They would begin making unusual expressions and using strange voices, and often these were the takes that made it into the final film. I think this is why Nicholson's performance is so memorable. The man acts like he's actually insane, and he has the ability to slip in and out of being a psychotic murderer man so effortlessly. Either The Shining has a protagonist, or it does not. Some may argue that Jack Torrance is both the protagonist and the antagonist, but then where does the Overlook factor in? It's at least somewhat implied to be a supernatural entity, so is it not the main antagonist? I think this movie is less concerned with having a conventional protagonist-antagonist story, and more concerned about showing the downfall of a man. The really terrifying thing about the hotel's influence over Jack is that it almost seems like the hotel isn't making Jack a monster. Instead, it's peeling back layers of Jack's personality until we're finally left with who Jack really is on the inside. He struggles with alcoholism, and after he injures Danny, their relationship is never the same again. His relationship with Danny and Wendy seems so strained in the movie. There are moments where he comes off as genuinely hateful and mean-spirited, especially toward Wendy.
Jack. Wendy, I have let you fuck up my life so far, but I am not gonna let you fuck this up.
Disregarding the protagonist-antagonist debate, Jack is obviously the bad guy. He's the villain of the movie, but he's so different from other horror villains. Yes, he's a man with a weapon and a will to use it. But the fact that, again, it's presented so differently than it is on paper that makes it so compelling. Spoilers for Fear Street. Skip ahead. But basically the killers in those movies kill because of the deal with the devil, but they're basically killing random people still. And Leatherface is just killing people for breaking and entering into his house. But they're random people who just happen to bump into a cannibalistic killer who wears a face on his face. In the OG Halloween, Michael's victims are just random people, you get the idea. These killers killed people who have no relationship with them. Yes, that's still scary, but I think the fact that in The Shining, the killer has a connection to his victims is even scarier. Jack is one of the scariest horror villains of all time because there's no fantasy, there's no spooky masks, just the cruel reality of the situation. This is his wife, this is his child, these are the people he's supposed to care for and protect, but instead he attempts to kill them. And that is much scarier to me, because it's unavoidable that at its core this movie is about domestic abuse. And all the discussions of interpretations about this movie meaning that Kubrick faked the moon landing or about the Holocaust or any of these other theories,
I feel like the most compelling one is right at the surface, and it rarely gets mentioned. The situation of domestic abuse struck me immediately on my first viewing of this movie. Jack verbally abuses Wendy, has physically abused Danny in the past, and at the end of the movie, of course, tries to murder them. Wendy and Danny are literally trapped in the hotel during the snowstorm, but they're also metaphorically trapped in this relationship with Jack.
As a spectator, of course you say, what are you doing? Get out of there. Get out. But in real life, things are never that simple.
I think the incident of Danny's injury really makes everything more interesting because it brings up the idea that maybe Jack wanted to kill his family before even coming to the Overlook. Sure, he was drunk, but that's no excuse, he still hurt his kid. It's fascinating because in the beginning of the movie, Jack seems really friendly and normal to everyone except his family. On the car ride, Jack already seems really angry with his family. Whether he planned on killing his family or not, he does try to, and it's handled very well. It does seem that Jack was influenced by the family's stay at the Overlook, whether that be just due to cabin fever or to the supernatural element. Like I said, during most of Jack's encounters with the spirits specifically, there are mirrors present. Now I noticed the frequent appearances of mirrors in this movie. I didn't know why on my first viewing, but I did notice that they were there. Behind the bar, there are mirrors. During the talk with Grady, Jack is looking in the mirror the entire time. He notices Mrs. Massey has changed by looking into a mirror. You get the point. In fact, the only time a ghost appears as a disembodied voice is when Jack is in the pantry. No mirrors are present. So either there are no ghosts and Jack is just looking at himself and imagining them, or there are ghosts and Jack is looking in the mirror for purely symbolic reasons. It does add an interesting layer to his conversation with Grady because Jack is looking into a reflection of himself. Either way, Jack does begin to become unhinged, and I think a lot of people point to the scene where he stares at the window as the beginning of this, but in my opinion, it comes with the scene directly before it. When Jack yells at Wendy not to interrupt him, it's the first time he's shown major aggression towards a family member in the movie. And if you've seen the movie before, and you know what Jack is typing, there's an incredible amount of tension. The scene is also the first time the F word is used in the movie. Profanity is used almost exclusively by Jack, and it makes sense why. It seems like he would be the character to curse the most. But it corresponds with his downfall and gives the profanity more purpose than it really should have. Basically, the more insane Jack gets, the more he curses. As for what Jack is typing, it's incredibly famous, and I think it's one of the 3 most remembered things from this movie. Here's Johnny, the twins, and what he types on the typewriter. Wendy realizes that Jack is completely insane and has been insane for a very long time, because what she finds is page after page after page of one repeated phrase. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. It's done so well, and the fact that we watch Wendy's face as she flips through pages and pages makes it all the more disturbing. And in the era of copy and paste, I think I should acknowledge the fact that he did this on a typewriter. He sat there and typed the phrase over and over. You can see all the little spelling mistakes, and that makes it seem like an insane person is typing this. And the following scene just might be my favorite in the whole movie. And if it's not, it's at least when Duvall and Nicholson are both at their best. They shot this scene over 100 times, and it turned out wonderful. It's one of the most tense and unnerving scenes in the entire movie. Wendy is crying as Jack slowly chases her up the stairs in the Colorado Lounge.
You have the slightest idea what a moral and ethical principle is, do you? Has it ever occurred to you what would happen to my future if I were to fail to live up to my responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
The scene really is the first domino that starts a chain reaction that leads to one of the most thrilling climaxes in horror cinema history. Jack feels like such a real and direct threat to his family, and the way he mocks them before axing the door is so unsettling. Again, I give massive props to Nicholson. His facial expressions during the scene don't even seem human. You can't keep your eyes off him.
Little pigs, let me come in. Not by the hair on your chinny chin chin. Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in.
Jack's complete and total insanity is showcased as he chases Danny through the maze. His threatening shouts of murder become delusional screams as he hears Wendy and Danny drive away in the snowcat. And after he freezes to death again, we get one of the most vague, confusing endings of all time. What does this mean? One answer is, of course, reincarnation.
You've always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
That would serve to explain the inconsistent naming of Grady. Perhaps the Charles Grady who murdered his family was a reincarnation of the Delbert Grady Jack talked to in the bathroom, just as Jack is a reincarnation of the man in the photo. Another interpretation I like is that this is just what became of Jack Torrance. He was yet another victim of the hotel. Now that he is dead, that's all he is. He's a part of it now, a tiny face on the wall, destined to be overlooked forever. Finally, justification for the many times I've said we'll discuss something later. If there is any movie that's been explained, theorized about, and interpreted to death, it's The Shining. In fact, there's a whole documentary about theories people think explain this movie. The documentary is called Room 237, and it is not very good. Don't get me wrong, it's incredibly entertaining, but if you're looking for good, grounded theories about The Shining, you should look elsewhere.
As soon as his name passes off the frame, stop and you will see that the clouds have Stanley Kubrick airbrushed into them, his face, with the beard and the wild hair and the whole thing. I know this one's a little harder to find, and I will have to Photoshop this one to show people it, but there is definitely a photograph of Stanley Kubrick in one frame, airbrushed in to the clouds.
Where? Now there are some interesting, good points made in this documentary, mainly about the symbolism regarding Native American genocide and the Holocaust. But most of the folks in this documentary seem to adhere to the notion that Kubrick made everything intentionally and he never made a mistake. Even things that are just accidental continuity errors. One person made the claim that Kubrick included a subtle parody by having a chair in one shot, a chair not in the next shot, and then it's back again in the next shot. See, this means Kubrick is parodying the common trope of furniture moving by itself in horror film. Or maybe he just made a mistake.
But you've got the skiing poster and my eye is drawn to it, and I realize that's not a skier. That's a minotaur.
No, it isn't. I actually do think the following parallel pointed out that the Overlook is the labyrinth and Jack is the Minotaur pretty interesting, especially with the implication that Jack has always been there. In the story, Theseus ties the thread to himself and then follows it back out to escape the Minotaur in the labyrinth, just like Danny follows his own footsteps back out of the hedge maze to escape Jack. That's definitely not intentional, but I still thought it was pretty cool. But that's just a skier, and there are a lot of points like these in the movies. One of the dumbest ones is that this whole movie is just Kubrick trying to confess and apologize for faking the NASA moon landing footage. The basis for this theory is that Kubrick hid little hidden messages all over through the movie that are supposed to justify this claim. But a lot of them are such a stretch. For example, in the book, the haunted room is 217. But the Timberline Lodge, the hotel in real life that was used for some exterior shots of the Overlook, asked that Kubrick change the number for the movie. This was because the Lodge didn't want people to shy away from 217 once the movie came out. There was no room 237 in the hotel, so they changed it to that instead. But the argument here is that Kubrick changed it willingly because the moon is approximately 237,000 miles from Earth, and when Danny first enters the room, he's wearing the Apollo 11 sweater. Yeah, alright. The two that are the most interesting to entertain are, again, the ones about the Holocaust and Native American genocide. There's a lot of symbolism to support that throughout, and the idea that our past is inescapable and will haunt us forever is prevalent throughout this movie. The Holocaust example is less relevant compared to the one about Native Americans, but there's still some imagery to support it. The typewriter is a German brand, and there are images of eagles throughout the hotel, a symbol of Nazi Germany. The one that's more supported is the theory about colonization and the Native American genocide. The Overlook was supposedly built on a Native American burial ground, and there are native designs on the walls and throughout the hotel. One of the most commonly cited ones is the stack of cans in the pantry. The idea that the supernatural events are caused by the desecration of a hollow burial ground is interesting for sure. The thought of the sacred land being used to build a lavish commercial hotel and decorating said hotel with artwork from the people whose burial ground is being violated is upsetting to say the least. Then there's this extremely out of place line.
White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
If you don't know, white man's burden is a racist ideology that it is the responsibility of white settlers to impose their beliefs and ideals on, in this case, Native Americans. This line confused me a lot when I first watched the movie. One, because I'd never heard the phrase before, and two, because of just how weird it is. But that's just a theory and interpretation. You don't have to subscribe to it if you don't want to, but I think it's intriguing to discuss. There are a bunch of little theories that don't require much elaboration. One of my favorites is the theory that the events of the movie are just the events of Jack's novel. But the last one I want to discuss is the no ghosts theory. This theory is explained in the title. The theory goes that in the Kubrick movie, there are no ghosts. The apparitions are a result of the deteriorating mental state of the three main characters. This theory does explore the presence of mirrors, especially with Jack's encounters with the ghosts. The idea is, again, that he's looking into himself, where the evil truly is. The major rebuttal towards this theory is when Grady unlocks the pantry door. But that happens off screen, and the leading alternative explanation to Grady opening the door is Danny opening the door. At this point, Jack is so delusional that he thinks that he's being offered a second chance by Grady, but in reality he's talking to Danny, who's offering one last chance of forgiveness. Of course, that's all just interpretation. You can buy into it, you cannot, it's their choice. I personally love the no-ghost theory and find the discussions about the Native Americans and the Holocaust interesting. But the moon landing one is just dumb.
And there's a key in the lock, and on the key is the words room and then the word NO, which is an old acronym for number, so room number 237, except that the only capital letters on the key are ROOM and then the N from the acronym NO. And if there's only two words that you can come up with that have those letters in them, and that's moon and room.
Only 2 words? You know what else I can spell? Moron.
Again, Room 237 is not a good documentary to watch if you want consistently interesting theories about The Shining. However, I wouldn't say it's not fun to watch. The amount of ludicrous theories in here is just really entertaining, and I think this documentary serves as a great example of how people overanalyze movies sometimes. Whether it deserves it or not, The Shining is easily one of the most overanalyzed and scrutinized movies of all time. I mean, some people argue that playing the movie backwards and forwards at the same time explains it. It's insane in the first place that after all these years, people are still trying to understand this movie, and I think that just shows what a legacy this film has. Like I said, I'm a new horror fan. I really only got into it this year, and The Shining was one of the first horror movies I watched. Horror movies are meant to scare, or at least to thrill. That doesn't mean a good horror film has to be terrifying. A lot of good horror films aren't. Dr. Sleep really isn't that scary, but I love it anyway. I've seen a few horror films that I've really enjoyed. Most of them have been brought up in this video. I really enjoyed the Fear Street trilogy. It had a unique story and really fun characters. And while they're not super memorable, they're at least still worth checking out. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a really great low-budget film with some really tense moments. Jaws isn't really a horror film, but it has some staple horror elements to it, and it's one of the best films I've seen this year. Now, I like all of these films, but here's the thing. None of them were really that scary to me, as outside of a few moments, I guess. Fear Street had some disturbing gore and some really interesting ways of being tension. My favorite of the killers is Ruby Lane, because you can always hear her echoey singing in the distance before you actually see her. Texas Chainsaw is so unrelentingly disturbing and has a really intense chase scene at the end. I'm not gonna lie, I felt a little nauseous by the end of it. Jaws is one of the most tense films ever. No wonder it's always cited as a perfect example of how to build suspense. I got that same feeling in my gut on my second viewing, even though I knew what was gonna happen. That being said, The Shining terrified me in a way that no horror film had before, or has since. While the other films are still really good, I was on edge the entire time while watching The Shining. It presents the horror so well, and that leads to a chilling viewing experience. The Shining messes with your head. It is psychological horror after all. With a slasher film, there are a lot of quick explosions of fear, and that's fine, but I like something like this way more. With this film, it's less about what you can see and more about what you can't see, and that goes for violence too. There's not that much violence in the film, but it relies on the implication of violence, and that's much more frightening. That sense of intense isolation brought by the Overlook adds to why this film is so scary. Not only are the Torrances trapped, but they're trapped in the Overlook Hotel, a building that is very clearly implied to have a supernatural element. But the way that supernatural presence interacts with the Torrances is so different in this movie compared to other haunted houses in horror films. The Overlook itself never really harms the Torrances. Instead, it shows them visions, laughing at them from afar, trying to get them to kill each other.
Perhaps they need a good talking to. If you don't mind my saying so. Perhaps a bit more.
The Shining is a slow build of tension that finally gets released in the climax. That might seem boring to some, but it makes the ending so much more thrilling. It's been slowly building for 2 hours, and it's finally knocked back in the climax. That same philosophy is applied to the scares themselves, just on a much smaller scale. And almost every scare, the camera focuses on the character's reaction before showing us what they've just seen. This works to create a very sharp increase in suspense right before the scare. It's brilliant.
Stop it! Red rum! Red rum! Red rum!
and other moments have scares built up for a long time. Look at Halloran's death scene. We know Jack is somewhere in the lobby, we just don't know where. And we follow Halloran from behind in silence with no cuts and nothing but the sounds of the wind until he eventually gets killed. The famous hallway scene with the Grady sisters works so well because the movie has spent all this time trying to enforce the idea that the Torrances are alone here. And then the mask is removed. This scene is marvelous because Danny's been on the tricycle before. We followed him a few times, always from the same camera angle, right behind him. We see things as he does. He rounds corner after corner and you expect something to jump out, but there's never a ghost around the corner, just a maze of hallways, until eventually something is around the corner. This isn't really a jump scare, but it's similar to one, but it doesn't have the same problem that most jump scares have, where the tension and the fear is immediately lost after the jump. It doesn't happen here because the threat is so direct yet so nuanced, calling out to Danny and to us. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it's gone. And that's not even mentioning the ticking time bomb aspect of Jack. We know he'll snap and we're just waiting for it to happen. But I think we've talked about Jack enough. The Shining has an intense, creeping dread that lasts throughout, and just makes the film even more unsettling to watch, not mentioning the dreadful thought of a man murdering his family. And all of this makes The Shining so much more compelling. Magnum Opus is defined as a large or important work of art, music, or literature, especially one regarded as the most important work of an artist or writer. Yes, the term usually pertains to an author or artist, and I consider 2001 to be Kubrick's Magnum Opus, but I think The Shining is the Magnum Opus of horror cinema. It is, in my opinion, the most important horror film ever made, and you can so clearly see its influence on other horror films since its release. And you'd suspect this movie to be an instant success, an instant classic, beloved since 1980, and you'd be wrong. The film was, and in some ways still is, controversial, though people have definitely praised it more and more as the years have passed. I feel like it's kind of basic to say that this is my favorite horror movie, because this is many people's favorite horror movie, but I can't really help it. People often like to criticize things for being too popular, but never really stop to consider why something is popular in the first place, and in my opinion, this film deserves every ounce of praise that it gets. Of course, Stephen King doesn't like it, and a lot of fans of the book also don't like it because of how different it is and how it kind of failed as an adaptation. Which I agree with to an extent, but I love the changes that Kubrick made while still loving the source material. And I still love this movie as a movie. Of course, it certainly influenced pop culture as a whole.
That's odd. Usually the blood gets off at the second floor.
And there's no doubt why people constantly try to explain this movie, because it can be scrutinized until the end of time. I just think it's impressive that after over 40 years, people are still discussing this movie, still trying to understand its meaning, and still recommending it to friends. I mean, just look at YouTube. Search for The Shining, and not counting all the movie clips that'll come up, you'll find video after video after video of reviews, analyses, and tinfoil hat theories. It's incredible. If I may, I'd like to shout out some of my favorite videos relating to this movie, because I now know that this movie is really hard to write about, and these should all be in the description. Super Eye Patch Wolf's video, Why The Shining is Terrifying, is a really good analysis of the horror of the film, and it also includes a segment about the miniseries. The Vile Eye has a series called Analyzing Evil, and the episode for Jack Torrance compares both the movie and book versions. Chris Stuckman is always enjoyable, and his video about the movie is good. And my favorite video about this movie is also one of the shortest. Video Game Donkey's video about this movie is really, really good, you guys. Also, this channel called the Movie Fanatics did an hour-long deep dive that I think was pretty cool. The art of film can give life to terrifying, beautiful, and wondrous pictures that can impact a person. No other film in recent memory has done that for me more so than Stanley Kubrick's 1980 masterpiece, The Shining. Yes, my love for this movie is incredibly obvious, and if I ever was to make such a long video about any one movie, it would be this one. I don't think I could write about any other movie for so long. Not even my favorite movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And I feel like I've experienced so much from this movie. I've of course seen it, but I've also seen the behind-the-scenes documentary by Vivian Kubrick, Dr. Sleep, Room 237, I've read the book, and I plan to read more King in the future. This movie left a mark on me. It got me invested in so much else. It finally got me to read King, and it got me more interested in horror. But it didn't need to. That was just a side effect, really. What I like most of all is just the movie itself, the way it's so expertly crafted, directed, shot, acted. I of course give this movie a 10 out of 10, and if you know me, that's a rare score. This video has been a long time in the works, but no film deserved it more. And if I want anything from this video, I want people to watch the movie. If you watch the whole video up to this point without watching the movie first, I'm mad at you, but I still want you to go watch it now. And if you have seen it and it's been a long time, watch it again. The Shining is a work of art. There's no getting around it. Because of the efforts made in perfecting the writing, the directing, the acting, we are left with a timeless, terrifying, and beautiful film. Its lasting impact on horror, storytelling, and filmmaking in general cannot be overstated. Because of my intense admiration for the film, I doubt I'll ever forget watching it. I doubt I'll ever stop rewatching it from time to time. Because that's what films can do for you. They can impact you, rock you to your core, terrify you. They can change you. And that's beautiful. Hopefully we keep getting movies like The Shining for as long as movies are being made. Forever, and ever, and ever. This is Brannick from the movie Fanatics, signing off.